what's kind of the state of things now during this COVID-19 pandemic in respect to emissions and then pollution?
Yeah, it has provided us sort of an interesting window, a sort of a natural experiment that we've performed, and we can learn something about the atmosphere and about the climate. Now, there are, when we talk about pollution, there are almost sort of two categories of pollution that we have to distinguish between. There's this sort of basic air quality pollution, air pollution. These are pollutants, smog, things that sort of stay in the atmosphere. They don't last very long, and the only reason that they're persistently there is because we're constantly producing them. So if you stop producing them, if you stop burning coal, or if you stop, you greatly reduce automobile transportation in particular, then you're going to see a pretty fast reduction in those sort of short-term pollutants, and that's what we've seen, and we've perceived, that the air is cleaner, and it's in a sense, it's been inspiring because it's really told us in very clear terms that we do have an impact on the environment, that we can clean things up if we make an effort to. And in this case, it's sort of an accidental impact of the lockdown response to the coronavirus threat. But it means that we have agency, that we can actually do something about these problems. That's the good news. The bad news is that the other sort of pollution I'm talking about here, the carbon pollution, is cumulative in the atmosphere. It stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. And so even if you stop producing carbon pollution, it stays in the atmosphere, and not just for decades, but much of it for centuries. So there's this much longer term commitment. And what that means in practice is that the lockdown has led to a fairly dramatic short-term reduction in carbon emissions, mostly because of reduced transportation. At the peak, I think in March, or maybe it was April, we saw a reduction of 17%. Carbon emissions dropped by 17%. That sounds huge. Well, they bounced back pretty quickly. Because sort of the lockdown has eased in some sense, and there's some return to business as normal. And so when scientists sort of crunch the numbers, what they've deduced is that by the time the year is over, we will have reduced carbon emissions for the year only about 4%. So this huge change in behavior, the lockdown, and what feels like sort of a fundamental shift in our lifestyle, in the end, will only have given us, a reduction of about 4% in carbon emissions for the year. And what's so sobering?
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, is that globally or is that just the United States?
That's globally. That's
okay,
globally.
Thank you.
And the numbers, I think, are similar to that in the U.S., but those are the global numbers. And what's sobering is the fact that if you look at how much we need to reduce carbon emissions to avoid warming the planet beyond dangerous levels, more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit, to avoid crossing that danger limit, we need to bring carbon emissions down by about 10% every year for the next decade. And so to me, what the real message here is that sort of individual changes in lifestyle and behavior can sort of give us a foot in the door. It makes a dent in those carbon emissions, but really we're going to need systemic solutions. We need a fundamental shift in sort of how we go about producing and using energy and resources in general. We need a pretty dramatic shift in policy to incentivize the sort of decarbonization of our economy if we're going to get there. Individual behavioral changes alone, they're great. They send a great example for other people, but it's not going to be enough.
So what is that tipping point, outside of the environmental impact, but is there any kind of, usability in, we're going to run out, is that what it's going to take?
Yeah, so there's a famous saying, and I forget exactly who first said it, but the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones. And the fossil fuel age won't end for want of fossil fuels. It won't end because we've literally, mined every last bit of petroleum and coal, natural gas. It'll end because we found something better, right? We used to use whale oil for energy, for burning, for lamps back in the 1800s. And what happened? Something better came along, fossil fuels. And now we understand, you know what, something better than that has come along. We can get energy without degrading the environment and the planet in the same way. That's renewable energy. And I think that's the great revolution of the 21st century, is going to be that transition away from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy, and it's going to generate lots of jobs. There's a positive vision that we can have of our future. It doesn't have to be gloom and doom. We can solve the climate crisis, and we can actually move into the 21st century and create new jobs and a flourishing economy by taking advantage of clean energy. And that's the direction I think things are going. I don't want to make a prediction about this next election, other than to say that I think that there might be an opportunity. People come to the voting booth thinking about it, climate change and climate action as they vote, all the way from the top of the ticket down to the bottom. Then I think we could find ourselves in a situation where moderates on both sides of the political spectrum can come together, and we have a coalition that's willing to actually make some headway. We're making progress at the local level, at the state level here in Pennsylvania. There's some leadership here on climate here at the state level. What we need is leadership at the national level, and then we need to sort of rejoin these international coalitions, like the one that led to the Paris Agreement, so that we all work collectively to solve what is arguably the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization. And if we can solve that challenge, then we leave a better world behind for our children and grandchildren.
In India, they're major, they're still using so much coal, and they're bigger polluters. They have more people. So I think you picked on that point, is, decarbonizing the economy, providing some kind of incentive for international cooperation in something like that, to alleviate that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there is sort of a bit of a mythology out there. It turns out that when it comes to China, by many measures is doing a whole lot more than we are doing. They are producing massive numbers of solar panels. They sort of flooded the global marketplace with cheap solar panels, to the point where the current occupant of the White House wanted to put a tariff on them too. And they have actually, so if you look at where China was 4 years ago, we had just reached a bilateral agreement between the US and China to make substantial reductions in carbon emissions. That sort of set the stage for the very successful Paris Agreement. And we saw, just a few years ago, this substantial policy development. China was on board. They were actually decommissioning coal-fired power plants. So not only weren't they building new ones, they were taking them down. They were ahead of their commitments under both the bilateral agreement with the US and the Paris Agreement. They were doing more than they were expected to do. Unfortunately, when we saw that sort of lapse in leadership here in the US on climate, that created a bit of an excuse for other countries like China to not do as much as they were doing. The argument being, hey, if you guys are going back on your commitment, if you're literally threatening to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, then why should we be working so hard to meet our obligations? And so my view is that we need that leadership at the national level. And if we return to being leaders on this issue, the international community will come together on this.
Yeah, leading by example. If the U.S. is supposed to be that guiding light.
Absolutely, my friend.
Need to be doing everything. So to kind of this is wonderful. Bringing this back. In your book, the madhouse effect, I think kind of what we're seeing happen now kind of dispels one of those myths of we can have, the world isn't so big that we can't have any impact. I mean, the coronavirus has quite literally shown us you can have some kind of short-term impact. I know it's not necessarily the reduction in carbon that we'd like to see, but, air quality is most certainly getting better.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Again, there is urgency, but there's also agency. Yes, we need to act. And yes, there are things that we can do right now. So that's what's important, that going forward, again, we think about this issue as we go to vote and elect our policymakers, because we get the politicians that we vote for. And if we want leadership on this issue, then we've got to support politicians who are willing to lead on this issue.
And I know some of this is people's memory, right? Everyone thinks 50 years ago it was 95 and sunny all summer long, and there was always 18-foot snowdrifts out in front of the house. So I get part of it is memory, but are we seeing anything different weather-wise in the last few months? I know probably some limited research on it, but are you seeing anything? Are your colleagues seeing anything?
Well, one of the things that we do think is happening, so as I said, there's sort of those two forms of pollution. There's sort of the short term, the pollutants we put in the atmosphere that form smog, and then there's the carbon pollution, which really stays in the atmosphere for the long term. We've seen a reduction in both, but its impact on the climate problem is much more subtle, because again, that CO2, most of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere is CO2 we already had, put into the atmosphere, and just reducing it by a few percent over less than a year really is almost undetectable if you look at the growing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But when it comes to these short-term pollutants, for example, coal burning transportation produces pollutants like sulfur dioxide, a gas which actually reacts to form particulates in the atmosphere. And these particulates reflect sunlight back to space. And so they actually have a cooling effect. This is part of why we saw less warming from the 1950s through the 1970s than since the 1970s, because we were producing this sulfur pollution, which was actually offsetting some of the global warming from carbon emissions through this reflecting sunlight back to space. It was an offsetting cooling factor. And then we passed the Clean Air Acts in the 1970s. We scrubbed coal-fired power plants from their sulfur dioxide emissions. And those sulfur dioxide emissions diminished, and we saw even more warming, because that warming that had been masked by these sulfate aerosols, as we call them, had largely dissipated. Well, something similar is going on right now, because there's still some amount of sulfur dioxide and other pollutants that we produce. And during the lockdown, we've seen a reduction in them. So we've seen a reduction in some of these aerosol pollutants that can have an offsetting cooling effect. That's why some scientists think that we might actually see a little bit of boost in warming, especially in the summer, here in regions like North America, where there is a fair amount of industrial activity and a fair amount of transportation. We might see just a little extra warmth this summer from this effect of the reduction in transportation and other activities that generate these aerosols. But that's a short-term, fleeting effect. And in the long term, what really, fundamental here is gaining control of these carbon emissions and reducing carbon pollution, because that's what's warming the planet.
Sure, but and just to be clear, the answer here isn't to just start increasing the sulfur pollution, because that's obviously horrible too. Yes.
Right, sort of a Faustian bargain. For a while, we were offsetting some of global warming through these industrial pollutants, but we were also acidifying our lakes and rivers and killing wildlife and creating worse acid rain. And there were all of these other negative impacts. So the last thing we want to do is to try to offset one problem by creating another problem.
So even if tomorrow the world shuts off CO2 emissions, is there still an increase after that, or does it immediately start to fall? How does the global balance kind of shake out?
Yeah, so it's really kind of interesting. And only over the last decade or so, as we've used more elaborate models that, for example, represent what we call the global carbon cycle. CO2 isn't just a dial that we change. When we put carbon into the atmosphere, some of it gets absorbed by plants, some of it gets taken up by the ocean. And so it turns out that if you incorporate the sort of complex dynamics of Earth's carbon cycle into a more comprehensive model, what you find is that there are actually two offsetting effects. The CO2 we've put into the atmosphere thus far continues to warm the planet for decades. And that's because some of that warmth is slowly sort of penetrating into the oceans. It takes a while for that heat to diffuse into the oceans. The oceans can take up so much of that heat that they sort of continue to warm for decades in response to the CO2 buildup up to now. So we sometimes call that the committed warming. We continue to see warming for decades, even after we stop emitting carbon. So if you thought only about that effect, you would think that temperatures continue to rise, even as we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere. But there's another effect. As soon as we stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, the ocean starts to absorb some of that CO2. It takes it out of the atmosphere. And so atmospheric levels start to drop. And it's entirely fortuitous, but it turns out that those two effects largely cancel the committed warming and the CO2 drawdown. So in the end, that has led to the conclusion that how much warming we see for the foreseeable future, the sort of global temperature thermostat, is really set by how much cumulative carbon we've put into the atmosphere up to now. How warm it's going to be for the next several decades is a function of how much carbon we've emitted up to now. What that means is that we can have a fairly immediate impact in that if we stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, temperatures stop warming. The flip side of that, the bad news, is that we're stuck with the warming that we have for decades and even centuries in the absence of sort of efforts, for example, to actively pull carbon back out of the atmosphere through reforestation or other artificial means, machines that suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Absent that sort of technology and those efforts, we're sort of stuck with where we are for the foreseeable future, but we can prevent it from getting worse. And that's the agency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's, wow, so that's interesting. And so does melting ice caps and glaciers, does that play a role into that as well? I'm sure it's put in a model.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another example of a sort of a very long time response component of the system. The ice sheets, like the oceans, are very sluggish in how they respond to warming. And unfortunately, that means that the warming that we've already caused will presumably lead to the loss of ice, the disintegration of the major ice sheets, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, for decades and centuries to come. And that means that that meltwater goes into the ocean, sea level continues to rise for centuries. So we are stuck with centuries of sea level rise now, simply from the warming we've already caused. And what that means is that, we need to mitigate, we need to stop, making the problem worse by putting carbon into the atmosphere, get off fossil fuels, but we're gonna need to adapt. Our shorelines, we're going to ultimately have to retreat from rising seas in places like Florida, large parts of the east coast of the US and the Gulf Coast and low-lying island nations around the world. Global sea level rise is going to be a reality for decades and centuries to come. And that's really, in a sense, points to the procrastination penalty. The longer you delay action, the more bad things you sort of lock in for the long term. And that's where we are. We can prevent the worst, but we're already stuck with some, unfortunately, some very negative climate change impacts.
And perhaps one of these impacts, I don't know how much the truth there is to this, but like the global thermohaline kind of circulation, if we dump all this fresh water in from the Greenland ice sheet, does that impact that at all? Could that then reorganize kind of weather patterns, quote unquote?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if your viewers will remember the movie The Day After Tomorrow. I think it was 2004. So it's already 15 years old. But that was it was sort of a caricature of the science of what would happen if we shut down the so-called thermohaline circulation, or we sometimes call it the conveyor belt. It's this warm current. We sort of associate it with the Gulf Stream, but it actually goes off into the North Atlantic and delivers a fair amount of heat into the higher latitudes of the North Atlantic. And it makes parts of North America and Europe warmer than they otherwise would be, a more moderate climate than it would otherwise be at such high latitudes. And so if you dump a whole lot of fresh water into the North Atlantic, then you make the water there lighter, because fresh water is lighter than salty water.
Mm-hmm.
And that inhibits the sinking. The water's lighter, so it doesn't want to sink, and it's the sinking motion in the subpolar regions of the North Atlantic that actually drive that conveyor belt that brings warm waters poleward into the North Atlantic. So we know that something like this happened at the end of the last ice age, when the ice sheets, melted very quickly relative to the timescales, geological timescales. It was relatively rapid. It was a timescale of a century or several centuries. And so all this fresh water that got dumped into the North Atlantic from the melting of the ice sheets actually led to a shutdown in this ocean circulation pattern. And there's some evidence that parts of Eastern North America and Europe returned to an ice age-like climate even after the deglaciation, the ending of the ice age, had commenced. And that lasted maybe up to 1,000 years because of that collapsing of the conveyor belt. There isn't nearly as much ice around today as there was at the height of the last ice age. And that means that the effect we would get now from the melting, say, of the Greenland ice sheet is much smaller than what we would have seen when there was a huge ice sheet over North America, all the way down to New York City. The effect is going to be smaller, but we've done some research, and other groups have done research showing that, in fact, that is likely to happen. And not only is it likely to happen, it appears to be happening sooner than we expected. And that's in part because the Greenland ice sheet is losing ice sooner than we expected, sooner than our models predicted. So that fresh water is going into the North Atlantic sooner than we expected. And so that conveyor belt already seems to be slowing down. Now, in reality, it doesn't mean we'll get another ice age. And nothing that's depicted in the Day After Tomorrow, the film The Day After Tomorrow, is likely to happen. You're not going to get tornadoes destroying Los Angeles and an ice sheet forming over North America in a matter of days. That's all, an extreme distortion of the science. What is likely to happen is that you get a little less warming than you otherwise would have had in parts of North America and Europe. And there's a little patch of ocean in the North Atlantic that actually cools. It's just south of Greenland, not too far from Iceland. And we see that if you look at global temperatures in recent years, where the oceans overall have been the warmest on record, there's a spot south of Greenland that has seen the coldest temperatures it's seen in decades. And we think that that's associated with the slowdown of this current. And so that would have some negative impacts. It would be bad for fish populations that we rely upon. It would probably decrease the productivity because it would inhibit sort of the overturning of waters that helps bring nutrients to the surface. The climate impacts would be moderate, but it would have other detrimental impacts. And it appears to be one of those, surprises that appears to be happening sooner than scheduled. And that's a recurring theme, that yes, there are surprises in store. There are uncertainties, but uncertainty isn't our friend. Some of these surprises are going to be unwelcome ones.
Yeah, hopefully not more cutoff lows that delay our seasons.
Yeah, no, well, they're right. And in areas like Newfoundland, they've had some gloomy, cool summers, and that might be associated with this slowdown in the ocean circulation.
What I've taken away from what you said is that, the pollution is down, and that's good. We've seen some short-term CO2 reduction, also good, but bottom line is it's not enough, not only for, purposes of climate, also not even long enough for the purposes of weather. We're not really seeing change. To see appreciable change, it's going to take a lot more than a pandemic.
That's exactly right.
Good. You've certainly done a lot of talks about this from national media outlets and podcasts. I kind of followed along on your.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
You're exceptionally busy, and I can't thank you enough for.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation. It was a great one.